Captain Daniel Reyes had carried the box from his father's attic to his own house 6 months ago, and it had sat in his closet, unopened, the entire time, wedged behind a row of dress uniforms he rarely wore. In a corner of the room he passed a dozen times a day without quite letting his eyes land on it. He knew what was supposed to be inside, or thought he did. His mother had died when he was 9, a long illness, the kind that took years instead of days, the kind that gave a family plenty of time to say goodbye, and somehow never enough. What he remembered of her was mostly impressions. The smell of her coat, the sound of her voice reading to him at night, the careful way she'd folded laundry like every fold mattered. And the answer she gave every single time anyone asked what she'd done in the army. Quartermaster, she'd say. Logistics. Supply requisitions, mostly. Nothing exciting, and she'd smile and change the subject. And that had been the whole of it for 30 years. A story so plain, so unremarkable, that nobody had ever thought to ask a second question. It was the kind of answer that didn't invite follow-up. The conversational equivalent of a closed door, painted the same color as the wall around it. His father had repeated it at her funeral, and at every reunion since, in the same flat, fond way people repeat things they've never examined. She kept the supply chain running, doll. Important work, just not the kind anybody writes books about. His father had said it so many times, for so many years, that Danny had absorbed it the way you absorb the color of your own front door. True, because it had always been true. Unquestioned, because there was nothing about it that invited a question. The box itself was small, a wooden case, military issue, the kind used for transporting sensitive documents decades ago, its hinges gone stiff with age, a thin layer of attic dust still clinging to the corners. On the lid, in his mother's handwriting, faded but still legible. For Danny, open when you're ready, love, Mom. He'd been ready for 30 years and had never once felt ready. Tonight, sitting alone in his quarters the week before his change of command ceremony, the week he was finally taking over a company of his own, the same week his father had moved into assisted living, and Danny had spent all weekend boxing up the house where he'd grown up, room by room, deciding what to keep and what to let go. Something about the timing made the box feel less like an open question and more like an appointment he'd been late to for 3 decades. He opened it. On top, wrapped in tissue paper gone soft and yellow, was a folded uniform jacket, not the kind Danny recognized from any photograph of his mother he'd ever seen. Beneath the jacket, a small velvet case held a set of ribbons, and a medal Danny didn't recognize either. The kind that didn't appear in any standard reference because, as he'd learned within the hour, it wasn't in any standard reference. Beneath that was a sealed manila envelope, government stamped, with a date 30 years old, and a classification marking that had been crossed out by hand and replaced with a single stamped word. Declassified. The new stamp was dated 2 years ago, and beneath the envelope, a letter, handwritten, his mother's handwriting, the same careful, looping hand that had written, "Open when you're ready." On the lid, the same hand that had signed birthday cards and packed lunch notes for the brief years he'd had her. He recognized it instantly, and for a moment before he even read a word, just holding the paper felt like something. Danny, if you're reading this, it's been a long time, and I'm sorry for that. I asked General Marsh to hold on to this for you until the right moment, and I trusted him to know when that was, because I wouldn't be around to decide for myself. I served with a unit called Task Force Wren. You won't find it in any history you've read, because until 2 years ago, it didn't officially exist. We were one of the first all-female intelligence units attached to Special Operations. 11 women, running signal interception and field intelligence in places and situations the official record still doesn't fully account for. I can't tell you everything even now, because some of it is still sealed. But I can tell you this, the work mattered. People came home because of it, and I never told your father, or you, or anyone, because that's what we were asked to do, and because by the time it might have been safe to tell you, I didn't want to be the kind of mother who made her own story bigger than her son's bedtime. The night before I went into the hospital for the last time, I called General Marsh. I asked him to hold this box until you were a soldier yourself, old enough to understand what it meant, and ready enough that it wouldn't feel like a burden. Just like a piece of the truth. I trusted him to know when that was. I hope he got it right. I'm proud of you, Danny. I always was. And now you know, So was I once, of myself. It just took a long time for anyone to be allowed to say so. Love, Mom. Danny read the letter 3 times before he picked up the manila envelope. General Thomas Marsh was 83 years old, retired 11 years, and lived in a modest assisted living community 2 hours from the base. A quiet place with a courtyard garden and a dining hall that smelled, perpetually, of coffee. The kind of place where most days passed without incident, and most visitors were family. So when the front desk told him he had a visitor, a young Army captain, asking about someone named Sergeant First Class Carla Reyes, the general went very still in a way the staff hadn't seen from him before. Still in the particular way of a man hearing a name he'd carried, unspoken for a very long time. Reyes, he said slowly. Carla Reyes's son? Yes, sir, Danny said when he was shown in, holding the wooden box carefully in both hands like it might still be classified, which in a sense, part of it still was. I found this. In my father's attic. There was a letter. She said she called you. The night before she went into the hospital. General Marsh finished, and sat down slowly in his chair, looking at the box like it was something he'd been expecting for 30 years and had, somewhere along the way, stopped expecting at all. She called me at 11 at night, said she needed a favor, soldier to soldier, and asked if I'd hold something for her son. Said I'd know when the time was right. He looked up at Danny. I want you to understand something, Captain. I've thought about that phone call more times than I can count. Your mother was the best signals analyst Task Force Wren ever had. Sharper than half the officers who outranked her, and steadier under pressure than anyone I served with, man or woman. When she called me that night, she didn't sound like a woman who was dying. She sounded like she was handing off an assignment. Like there was one more piece of unfinished business, and she wanted to make sure it got handled right. 30 years, Danny said quietly. You held on to this for 30 years. I held on to it, Marsh said, because I made her a promise, and because, frankly, Captain, I didn't always know if the right time would ever come. The unit stayed classified far longer than any of us expected. There were years I genuinely wondered if I'd die with that box still in my closet, having never been able to give it to you at all. He reached out and rested a hand on the lid, briefly, the way you might touch something that had outlasted a war. When the declassification came through 2 years ago, I thought, now's the time. But I didn't know how to just show up at a stranger's door with a box and 30 years of explanation. I kept telling myself I'd find a way. He looked at Danny, and something in his composed, military bearing finally cracked, just slightly. Not into tears, but into something quieter, more like relief. You found it yourself. Saved an old man the trouble of working up the nerve. The change of command ceremony was scheduled for the following Saturday, and Danny, after a long conversation with General Marsh, and an even longer one with his father, made one request of the outgoing commander running the ceremony. A few minutes, near the end, for the general to say something. Nobody outside the small circle who already knew expected what came next. Before we close today's ceremony, General Marsh said, stepping to the podium in his old dress uniform, the one he still kept pressed and ready for occasions like this, I'd like to read something into the record. It concerns a unit most of you have never heard of, because until 2 years ago, it officially didn't exist. He read the declassified citation in full, Task Force Wren, the intelligence work, the operations it had supported, the lives it had been credited, in cold official language, with having protected. And then, at the end, he read a single name that had been redacted from that record for 30 years and unredacted only recently. Sergeant First Class Carla Reyes. Captain Reyes's mother, Marsh said, served with distinction in a unit this country didn't acknowledge existed until 2 years ago. She kept that secret for the rest of her life, including, as far as I know, from her own family. I had the privilege of serving alongside her, and the responsibility, more recently, of making sure her son eventually learned the truth. I'm glad to say that responsibility is now fulfilled. In the crowd, Danny's father, 81 years old, in a wheelchair, wearing the good suit he saved for occasions, sat very still. Danny had told him the day before, as gently as he could, what was in the box. His father hadn't said much at the time, but now, hearing the citation read aloud, hearing his late wife's name spoken in a context he'd never once imagined, something in his face shifted. Not shame, not regret exactly, just the weight of 30 years of believing a smaller story than the true one, finally set down. After the ceremony, Danny found his father looking at the framed photograph Danny had kept on every desk he'd ever had. A photo of his mother, young, in civilian clothes, standing with a group of women his mother had always described as old work friends from the supply depot. "I used to ask her about that picture," his father said slowly. "She always said the same thing. Just some of the girls from work." He looked up at Danny, and for a moment looked younger than Danny had seen him look in years. "Some of those girls from work are sitting 3 rows back, son. I recognized 2 of them when they walked in. They're in their 80s now, same as me. They came all this way." Danny looked toward the back of the small crowd, where 4 elderly women sat together, dress uniforms decades out of style, but worn with the same quiet precision his mother's letter had described. Task Force Wren, what remained of it, come to see a promise finally kept. "She kept your secret for 30 years too," Danny said quietly. "Both of you carried something the other one didn't know about. I think that letter wasn't really about telling me who she was. I think it was about making sure, eventually, somebody could tell you." His father reached out and took the framed photograph from Danny's hands, looking at it for a long moment, at the woman he'd loved for 40 years, and it turned out, had never fully known, and then, carefully, set it back down on the table between them, facing outward now where anyone could see it. "Nothing exciting," his father said softly, and for the first time in 30 years, the words sounded less like a fact and more like the kindest lie a tired, grieving man had ever told, one his wife had asked him, without ever asking, to keep. "I should have asked more questions. She wouldn't have answered them," Danny said. "Not then, but she answered them anyway. She just waited 30 years to do it." He looked at the photograph, then at his father. "I think that's the part that gets me most. She didn't just keep a secret. She kept faith that someday it wouldn't need to be one anymore. And she made sure it would be there when that day came, even though she'd never get to see it herself." Behind them, General Marsh stood with the 4 women from Task Force Wren, all of them looking at the photograph too. 5 old friends and 1 old commander, finally able to say, out loud after 30 years of silence, exactly who that quiet woman in the photo had really been.